Today is January 22nd, 1987. This is Joe Todd, an interview with Mr. Lewis Camus, and we're in the state capitol, and you're from Freedom, Oklahoma.
Right.
Mr. Camus, where were you born?
I was born in Knowles, Oklahoma, in Beaver County,
And when's your birthday?
October 24th, 1921.
Who's your father?
My father was named Frank Munsor, M-U-N-S-O-R, Camus, K-A-M-A-S.
And your mother?
My mother's name was Mabel, M-A-B-E-L, Shallop, S-H-A-L-L-O-U-P, Camus.
And where were your parents born?
My father was born in Lebanon, and my mother was born in Alva, Oklahoma.
Is that Lebanon, Oklahoma?
Lebanon, Syria.
Oh, Syria.
Lebanon, And that it was Syria then. It's Lebanon now.
Okay. I was thinking there is a Lebanon, Oklahoma.
Yes.
Okay. When did your father come to this country?
About I believe it was 1917.
1917. Did he tell you why he came?
He was just a young boy in Lebanon, and he wanted a better life. And some of his brothers and sisters had already come to this country, and he come to meet them and live there, and then later became a citizen.
Did he talk about the trip over?
Well, he come over on a boat, and they went to South America first, and then from there to America from that point, Ellis Island.
Any reason why they went to South America first?
Well, no reason except that's the route the boat took when he left the country.
Did he talk about coming through Ellis Island?
Well, he stated a little bit about Ellis Island, that he didn't really know how to talk English or anything like that, and it was kind of rough going through understanding what he was supposed to do, and they finally routed him where he wanted to go, and he came to this country then.
Why did he come to Oklahoma?
Well, because originally he went to New Mexico, where his oldest sister lived, at Magdalena, New Mexico, and he worked in the mines there for a while. His brother lived in Wichita, and another sister lived in Wichita, Kansas. And after he worked in the mines a while, well, then he come across the country on a couple of horses, bareback horses, rode through the country to Wichita, Kansas, and there he worked for a Cudahy packing company. And he and his brother both worked at the Cudahy packing company, and they lived with his sister. And from there, well, then he come to Oklahoma just because one brother, the brother that he worked with in Kansas at the Cudahy plant, had come to Oklahoma in western Oklahoma at Beaver County. He set up a kind of a mercantile business, and my dad joined his brother there and worked with him in the mercantile business. And then from there, well, he decided that he wanted a business of his own, so he left Beaver County and come through Woodward County and up to Freedom, Oklahoma. There he became stuck in the sand and decided, well, people treated him real well there and was friendly, and he said, we'll just set up business here, and he set up a general mercantile business there in Freedom, Oklahoma, and that's where we've been ever since.
What town in Lebanon was he born? Do you know?
I'm Arab, A-R-A-B, A-I-N-A-R-A-B. It's a little town.
What part of Lebanon is that located?
Well, it was near Beirut and between Beirut and Damascus somewhere.
What type of work did the family do in Lebanon?
They were sheep herders at that time. Herded sheep in the rural areas.
Did when the family first came over, did they have any trouble leaving Lebanon to come to
No,
the
no
U.S.?
trouble whatsoever.
And when did the first family member come over? You know?
I don't really remember, but it was probably sometime around 1908, 1910, in that area at the time.
And how old was your father when he came over?
He was just, I think he was 18 years old.
Did he ever talk about life in Lebanon?
Oh, somewhat. He said that he herded sheep and goats, and that most of the time stayed out in the country, you know, didn't come into town much, you know, because he stayed out with the sheep and the goats, and that he sort of he didn't ever attend what you call an organized school of any kind. He got all his education just through the hard knocks. At the time of his death, he was able to speak 3 or 4 different languages, you know, and he could do mathematics faster in his head than I could with paper and pencil. And a lot of times he would tell me, he says, I want you to figure up how much, you got it off. You have it on?
Yeah.
A lot of times he'd say, son, he says, write down these figures. And I'd write them all down, and he said, I add them up, and I'd go to work adding this column of figures, and he'd say, you should come up with this answer. And I said, well, Dad, if you already know the answer, why did you have me do this? And he says, well, I just want to make sure. And he was real fast with mathematics, and just self-taught.
So your father ran a mercantile store.
Yeah.
Did you work in the store as a small boy?
As a small boy, I did, and I worked. We weren't what you call wealthy people or anything like that, and I worked there, and I also, while I was in school, I had club projects, you know, the FFA, 4-H, and so on, and I would milk some cows, and I'd sell. My mother would bottle the milk, and I'd deliver the milk around town, and then sort of paid my own way, you know, and he always had his support, of course, but that's the way we really got started. We worked hard, and we worked on weekends, and
What was the name of the store?
and Camus Cash Store,
Camus
and
Cash Store.
that was at Freedom, Oklahoma, yes.
And
And
he came there in 1917, you say?
1921, actually.
21, I'm sorry.
I was just a baby
Okay.
when we come to Freedom.
How far from Freedom is Knowles?
Oh, about 75 miles
75
west.
miles.
Yes.
Okay. In the mercantile store, where did your father get his supplies for the store?
Well, of course, in those early days, why, there were places set up in different areas like Alva, Woodward. There was wholesale houses that made grocery deliveries, and he also, in this store at that time, sold furniture, had a furniture, dry goods, general mercantile store, and they got their supplies just around in their local areas. In those days, well, they delivered them kind of by wagon and later by little trucks.
Would you give me a description of Freedom from a child's point of view?
Well, when I was growing up, why, it was, of course, an early day town, and a railroad went through there, and Freedom had been located about 5 miles north of where the present location is. But when the railroad come through, they moved the town down to the railroad. We had a little small elevator. We had a little small lumber yard. We had a couple of grocery stores and
Who
barber
ran the
shop.
different stores, like the lumber yard and the grocery stores?
What was that?
Who ran the lumber yard and the grocery stores?
Okay, the lumber yard was run by Star and Cable, and then later became Cable Lumber Company. And the oil and gas business, the filling station, was J.E. Guthrie, which was an old-timer. And there was another store there run by His name was Clyde Robinson, and we had an old kind of a garage thing there. It was run by a fellow by the name of Emil Archer, and they were just different people that were in business there. There was another bunch of people that run the hardware. Their name was Riley, and a lot of those people are not around anymore, but the business has continued under different names or were sold to other people, and we have real live wire town.
Who founded the town of Freedom? Who founded the town of Freedom?
I really don't know who the persons was that founded the original town of Freedom. I suppose it was somebody like J.E. Guthrie, and that maybe founded the first part of the Freedom, which was north of Freedom 5 miles, and maybe some people by the name of French, L.C. French, because the town of Freedom was on property owned by those two people. And later then, of course, the town moved to Freedom, down where the present location is now.
Why the name Freedom?
Well, in the early days, when they wanted to name the town, they wrestled with it quite a lot. The first original name was Annis, Oklahoma, because of a family that ran the post office was named Annis. And then later, why, they felt like that since they were in an area that was so wide open and free looking, that they just call it Freedom, Oklahoma. So the name was changed to Freedom, Oklahoma.
Was it in the area opened by the Cherokee Strip in '93?
Yes, I'm sure it was.
Did you know anyone in the town that made the run of '93?
Well, I'm not real sure about that, who were the ones that made the run. I know there were some there, and possibly people like Bird Bates, a lady by the name of Mrs. Maud Drake Bingham, maybe some of the people that came there in the early days came with cattle drives and different things like that, and worked on those big ranches that was in what they call M territory at that time. And of course later that territory was divided up in counties. But there's a lot of people I know that did make the run, but I don't know their names.
Where did you start to school?
I started school in Freedom, Oklahoma.
What year?
And it was I was 6 years old, so that would make it 1927.
And what was the name of the school?
Freedom Public Schools. And I graduated. I went all my years at Freedom High School, Freedom Grade School, and Freedom High School.
How large was the grade school that you attended?
Oh, there was probably eight grades, and we averaged probably about 20 to 30 children in each class.
Remember your first teacher's name?
Mrs. Bocock. And
how do you spell that?
her name was B-O-C-K. Let's see, let's see, B-O-H. I think it's B-O-H-C-O-C-K. I believe that's a...
Were the streets of Freedom paved when you were a child?
No, it was just nothing but sand. And later they brought in a bunch of gyprock and busted it, and was done by people wanting to work out their poll tax. At that time they had a poll tax, and these people come in and haul this rock in and bust the rock to pay up, to get credit to pay their poll tax.
What type of paving does Gypron make?
Well, they break it up into chunks, and it packs down in that sand, and it makes a solid type of a road. But of course, since that time, why, of course, it's paved now.
Where'd they get the gyprock?
From the hills out there. We have gyprock hills.
How far is Freedom from the Alabaster Caverns?
6 miles.
6 miles. I was going to ask, before they used the gyprock, what were the streets like in town when it rained?
Well, of course, it didn't get what you call muddy. It probably was better after it rained because the sand was just real loose, you know. But a lot of people, of course, when it was first, Freedom was first established down there, they had horses and wagons and things like that, and they didn't mind too much. But when my folks come there, we'd come there in an old Model T, and of course it got stuck in that sand. And after a rain, it would maybe make it a little more solid, and you could get around a little better. But then later, of course, when they put the gyprock down, it made it so you could get around real good.
I was going to ask, did you make deliveries for your father in the store?
Oh yes, people would send an order down, and my mother and father or whoever was working would put the order up, and then we would deliver it.
How'd you deliver it?
Sometimes first by just carrying it to different places in town, and later on when we had little cars and things, we delivered in a car. And
okay. And you graduated from high school in what year?
1939.
1939. Of course, being from northwest Oklahoma, tell me about the dust storms, the Depression.
Well, in the Depression days, of course, I was sort of young, but at that time, besides the mercantile business, we also started, having some land and some cattle and different farm animals and products. And I can remember one time my dad decided that we needed to go out to the farm to do some things, and on the way to the ranch, one of these big black dust clouds come over, and you couldn't see anything once you were inside of that dust storm. And my dad, I remember we got to this one place where they had a water well, and he took some cloth and stuff that we had in that little car pickup, and he'd wet that, and we'd hold that over our faces till the storm kind of let up, or we could go on. It was so bad that you couldn't see in front of you, and when the storm was over, there'd be sand inside your house, inside the windowsills, and it was a terrible time.
What does a dust storm look like when it's approaching?
It just looks like a big old storm cloud coming rolling towards you. It just looks like a big storm. It looks like a big old dark black cloud's what it looks like. But you can see it rolling because of the sand that was picking up and moving.
How long would a dust storm last?
Oh, sometimes they would move out pretty fast, maybe in an hour or so. Sometimes they'd last, the effects of it the dust would still be hanging in the air maybe 2 or 3 days, It sometimes lasts quite a while.
Yeah. How did the Depression affect the store, the Camus store?
Well, of course, my father operated on a credit system, and people would come in and get things and charge it, and they'd pay as they could. And it got to the point where some of those people couldn't pay their bills because they ran out of something to pay with. And so that was really how we got started in the cattle business and ranching business and stuff, is because if they couldn't pay cash, they'd bring either eggs, chickens, or pigs, or a cow, or something, and trade it for their bill, And so then we had to have a place to put them. So my father started out just renting a little place to put them. And from then, we just kind of kept developing and getting bigger and bigger because people kept charging things and they couldn't pay for them, so they'd bring in some more cattle or some more sheep or some more chickens or pigs, and we had a place to keep them. Then of course, my father had a butcher shop as well, so some of those we would butcher and sell right back through the butcher shop, you know. And pretty soon we had enough that we had to start buying some land. Well, some of those people that were leaving the country because they went completely broke, they were going to go to California or somewhere to try to find a newer life. Well, my dad would find out how much they owed on the place, and he'd take over their notes, you know, in return for the deed to the place. And some of those were notes. Some of the land was bought as cheap as $2 or $3, $5 an acre, some $10 an acre. And my father, as he made the money or got the cattle and made money on those cattle or sold them, well, he'd use that money to pay a down payment on that, take over that mortgage. And that's how we developed our ranch.
And where's the ranch located?
The ranch is located, we had two ranches. One was located about 3 miles north and 3 miles east of Freedom. And the other ranch was located about 16 miles north of Freedom, just about 3 or 4 miles south of the Kansas line.
What started the dust storms?
Well, the dust storms were started, of course, by poor conservation practices, such as plowing up all the sod and not having any windbreaks or anything like that, and the drought come, and it just left that soil loose, and when the wind would blow, it started a dust storm.
And how many years were those storms around?
Well, I can remember that they lasted through the good part of the 30s, and even probably later than that on occasion, you know, from western Kansas. But when the soil conservation people, the programs were installed back in those days, they started planting windbreaks and doing some conservation practices that soon done away with the dust storms. But they still, even to this day, if we have a drought, we have mild dust storms.
Did you do any work for the CCC or Wta program?
No, I never worked in those programs at that time. I was a little younger than some of them that went to do those kind of things, but I have a lot of friends that did work in CCC and work programs.
After high school, what did you do?
Well, of course, after high school, I went to college at Northwestern State College at that time, and then from there I went to OSU, which I was there when Pearl Harbor came along, and then I went into service shortly after that.
What were you studying? What was your major?
Yeah, mostly agriculture and in the business field.
What was your reaction when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Well, I was pretty well shocked that it happened, and I can remember that that Sunday afternoon, I was in the movie show at OSU on a Sunday afternoon. When I come out, I heard about it, and then of course we had immediately the next day heard the president's speech in Gallagher Hall, and so then I knew that I would have to go, so I went back home to help my father until my turn come to go to the service. And so it was shortly after that I went right into
service.
Was that
Dr. Bennett?
Dr. Bennett was there, yes.
Right. When you went to Northwestern, did you live on campus or off campus?
No, I lived off campus because at that time we had already sold the mercantile business to a relative that we had there working with us, and when I decided to go to college, my family decided to just move over, and we bought a house in Alva, and my brother and sister then graduated from school in Alva, and I went to Northwestern, and then from there I transferred over to Oklahoma A&M, was what they called it then.
What about at A&M? Did you live on campus?
I lived on campus, and I lived at the farmhouse
Farmhouse.
fraternity.
Still there. I went there 2 years at
Did you?
OSU.
Yeah.
When did you join the service?
I went in the service. I first went, of course, when I was inducted into the service, I went to Fort Sill. From there, I went to a place in, let's see, it was a Signal Corps base in Arkansas. And then from there, I transferred into the Air Force. Air Force was, United States Air Corps had priority on all inductees if they wanted them, and so I applied to be transferred to the Air Force. And from there, of course, and when I was accepted, I went to California to base out there for my training.
Where did you take your basic training?
I took my, I guess you would call it your basic training at Raton, New Mexico first, and then from there I went to Las Vegas to gunnery school, and then I went to
Nevada or New Mexico?
I went to New Mexico.
New Mexico.
Yeah, and it was at Raton, New Mexico, where I took most
I mean,
of
Las
my,
Vegas.
yeah, well, it wasn't Las Vegas. At Las Vegas, Nevada,
Yeah, okay.
I took gunnery school.
Right.
Aerial
It's Las
gunnery
Vegas,
school.
New Mexico,
Yeah.
too. Yeah.
Yeah, and so then when I graduated from cadets, I was in California at one of the bases out there.
Tell me about your basic at Raton. What?
Well, at Raton, it was mostly. Of course, I went into the bombardiering section of the cadets, and I flew practice bombing in that area. And of course, I got my commission there, and but I had been out at California before that, and then come to Boca Raton for my training, and not Boca Raton, but Raton. And after I got through school there, after practicing bombing and learning all the bombing techniques and how to use all the bomb sites and things like that, well, then I was sent to Langley Field, Virginia, for radar training. And from there, of course, we flew practice missions all up and down the coast. From there, I went to of course, I was at Boca Raton for some radar training in Florida, and then I went from there to back to Langley Field, and then from there I went overseas.
Were you in the States? Did you hear about Boise City when you were in the Air Corps? Because, you know, Boise City was bombed.
No, I didn't. I don't remember that.
You're familiar with the story, aren't you?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That was in 43.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where was the bombing range from Raton?
Well, at Raton, we flew all around the New Mexico area, out in that arid part of the country. There was another base at let's see, what it was, Middleton, or I can't remember the other name of the other base, but we practiced bombing on targets in that barren area out there around Raton, south and east.
Around what's the
Big
volcano
Springs.
out
I
there?
think there's in the Big Springs area and in some of those.
Around Mount Capulet?
Yeah. Well, we never bombed anything north of there where Mount Capulet is, but it's always back down in that arid area back south and east.
How big was the base of Raton?
Well, I suppose that they probably were 10 to 15,000 people there.
Now, where was the base in comparison to the town itself?
It was southeast.
Southeast. Is that where the airport is now?
Well, I'm not sure where the airport. I haven't been back out there for a long time.
I forgot to ask, when did you join the service? What year?
Well, it was in 1943, I think.
43. Okay. And you were sent to England?
Yes.
Did you fly or go by boat?
we flew over in a new bomber, and then after we got there, of course, that was just transporting the bomber over, and then they assigned me to a base there.
B-24, B-17?
B-17.
B-17, okay. So you were on B-17s?
Yeah.
Okay. And what part of England?
Well, we were north of London in a place called Attleborough, Alconbury, and places like that. I spent time at 2 or 3 different places there, training and flying practice missions and things like that. But Attleborough, I think, was where I was at the time that I was flying out on missions to Germany.
Did you get to London?
Yes, I'd been in London 2 or 3 times.
Were you there when the Battle of Britain, I guess the bombing of London?
I was in London one night when one of those buzz bombs come over. Yes.
Tell me about it.
Well, it kind of worried you. Of course, we had our leave to go for a couple 3 days, and we'd go down to London. And when we'd hear those things coming over, of course, you always wondered where that thing was going to hit, and it worried you and it scared you. It was kind of a weird feeling to hear that thing going over.
What did it sound like?
Oh, just kind of a whirring sound. And with the English people.
The first combat mission you flew, what were your thoughts?
Well, of course, we were so brainwashed that we felt like nothing could happen to our plane or to anybody on our plane. So we felt like we were sort of invincible. They instilled that into us very much, that you just felt like that nothing would ever happen to you personally. And you could always see somebody else's plane get shot down or something, and see people bailing out and things like that, and you'd think, well, that never happened to me, it just happened to them. But you soon find out it can happen to anybody.
When did you fly your first combat mission?
Let's see, I think it was to Hamburg.
Okay, and was it in 44?
It was in, 1944.
Were you there?
Let's see, it was in 44.
Were you there for D-Day?
No, I come after D-Day.
Okay. What's a bomb load of a B-17?
Well, I don't remember how many pounds it was. We had seemed like 6 or 8 bombs in the bomb bay. They were those great big old bombs.
How many missions did you fly?
I was shot down on my 10th mission.
10th mission. Tell me what happened. What?
Well, we were flying a mission to Germany to relieve some of the problems that the fog caused for the 101st. And there was a time when fog was so bad you could hardly see in front of you. And I think we were on the ground for about 3 days. Couldn't fly because of the fog. As soon as it lifted, we flew missions one right after another to relieve the 101st. And because they were in what they call the Battle of the Bulge. And we were to fly support for them. And when we went over the line a little ways, of course the flak was pretty heavy, and flak hit our number 3 engine, and we were on the bomb run at the time, and we went ahead and finished the bomb run and dropped our bombs. But when your number 3 engine is hit, it sets a fire pretty quick. And our wing was on fire, and you have about 30 seconds or to a minute to get out before it explodes. So we went ahead and we dropped our bombs and then bailed out. Turned out a pattern and bailed out.
Tell me about bailing out. What were your thoughts and how did you do it?
Well, of course, you're pretty scared, pretty worried, and but when you hear the command to bail out, you know you don't have much time. And really, the thing is, it's if you don't act like you're trained to act, you might blow up in the bomb bay or in the airplane. And so it was just more or less automatic, and you jump out, and you know you're either going to get blown up or burned or jump out, and you jump out. And of course, everybody was scared. But you take that leap out there, and then you pull the ripcord.
Had you been given any training?
Oh yeah, we've never made any jumps, but we've been trained, you know, how to get out of a plane. We had a practice plane where you sitting on the ground out there, and how to jump out, and we had a lot of training for that kind of a thing. And
how high were you?
We were at 26,000 feet. It was cold up there.
When you jumped out, what was your thought when you first got
Well,
to the airplane?
You just jump out and realize all of a sudden that gosh, you look up and you see that parachute, and you thank God that it had opened and everything, and it's a real lonely feeling to see those planes that didn't get hit go off and leave you. And then when you come down, why, the soldiers on the ground, you know, were Germans, and they shoot at us, and I had several holes in my parachute when I come down. They didn't hit me, but they hit the parachute. I could hear that crack of the rifle, and then I could hear a plunk, you know, just where it hit the parachute, you know. And we happened to bail out in a wooded area, and then, of course, we hit trees coming down through. And some of us got injuries from falling through the trees, but we were lucky to be alive. And
Where were you?
I was at Iran, I guess it's Germany or Belgium. It's on that border in there. We weren't, but just 10, 15 miles from the border.
Okay, now, were you in Germany or were you in Belgium?
Well, it was in, we called it Iran, Germany, but it was at the Belgian border, close to the Belgian border. And
was that in the Ardennes Forest?
I'm not sure what the force was. But anyway, we hit the ground, we got rid of our parachutes, and of course, even though we had injured, we were still able to kind of move around. And about that time, some soldiers come running up over the hill with their gun pointed towards us. And they were the old-time soldiers. They were what they call the Wehrmacht, and they were really going to try to help us get back across the border. And they motioned for us to follow them. Those of us that they kind of gathered up there, they motioned for us to follow them, and we followed them. And then pretty soon, then they rushed around and got behind us and said, you know, made us understand that the younger soldiers were up ahead of us and that we couldn't get through, and that they'd have to take us in then. And some of the fellows that could understand a little German understood that if they didn't take us in, then of course their lives would be in jeopardy. So they had to turn us over to the other soldiers.
Were they willing to let you go free?
The older ones were willing to try to get us back over the border. And but we ran into the young troop, and they took charge. And then, of course, they took us to a railroad head there and held us there in the depot.
Where? What town was that?
It was at this place called Iran.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And then we were transferred from there to Frankfurt, Germany, for interrogation.
Tell me about when you first saw the German soldiers. What were you thinking at that
Well,
point?
of course, you never knew what was going to happen when you run into the enemy, you know. And you didn't know whether they were going to just shoot you or take you prisoner or what. So you just did what they told you to do. hoping that they wouldn't shoot you, you know. And
How many of the crew members were captured?
well, all the crew members were captured that I know about, except one man, and he was shot up so bad from flak, and that we bailed him out, hoping that maybe he could get some medical attention or something. And I saw some of his effects, you know, like his billfold and his identification, because they asked us if we knew that man, because we were told not to say anything. And but I did see his billfold. And 7 years later, well, they wrote to me again after I got out of service, asked me if I could give them any further clue on what happened to him, because that was when they were trying to either declare him dead or missing in action or whatever. And I didn't know any more about it, and I guess he must have died.
Tell me about being interrogated in Frankfurt.
Well, we were sent to Frankfurt for interrogation, and of course all we were required to say, what we were trained to say, was just our serial number and our name. And every time they ask you a question, you just give them your name and your serial number. And they kept you around for a couple of weeks, hoping that maybe they could break you, you know. And I suppose some do break down and tell them something, but I never did have to tell them anything. I didn't tell them I was a radar operator, because that was all secret at that time. And so then after about 2 weeks there, well, they sent me to Barth, Germany, northern part of Germany, to Stalag Luft number 1.
Stalag Luft?
Luft, L-U-F-T, number 1 at Barth, Germany.
Is that for the Air Force?
Air Force, yes.
Yeah. How were you treated by the Germans?
Well, I was never tortured or anything like that. It was sort of end of the war, and they didn't have anything much to feed you, and they would get you out from a roll call every day, no matter what the weather was, things like that. But
what's the date? What date were you shot down?
January 2nd, 1945.
How many men were at Stalag Luft number 1?
Well, there were thousands of them. I have a book at home that gives all those figures, but I don't have it here with me. But there must have been 10,000, 15,000.
Were they mainly all Americans, or they're different?
Americans.
Okay. How many men were in your
Americans.
compound?
There was some English, I suppose, there.
How many were in your compound where you were? How many men were in your compound?
Well, in the room that I was in, I think there was about 20 men in our room, and they had shelves like for bunks, you know, about 3 high, and you slept on those bunks. They issued you a couple blankets, and they had an old thin straw mattress, and if you wanted to keep warm, you had to buddy up with 2 or 3 that slept in the same shelf with you, and maybe use one blanket on the bottom or 2, and the other 2 or 3 on top, you know, to keep warm. And they fed us, of course, or we fed ourselves. They brought it around, you know, and we.
What the meal consist of?
Oh, barley soup, and sometimes they'd butcher horses that was killed on the front line. Sometimes those had maggots in them, and you had to be awful hungry to eat some of them.
How big was the building that you were in?
Well, of course, the building was just like any other barracks in the United States, only except they were divided up in rooms instead of one big room. Yeah. And there was about 18 to 20 in each room.
And how many rooms in the building?
And then probably about, I suppose, about 10, 12.
How'd the guards treat you there?
The guards never did bother us too much. They were always around somewhere, and of course we had our own lookout system and a warning system. When they did show up around, we'd let everybody know.
What was your warning system?
Well, we always had a guard of the day of our own, lookout, and they would warn us.
Did you get any news in from the outside about how the war was going?
Yeah, we had a smuggled in radio equipment, and we had a little newspaper called POW News and stuff like that. If you'd like to continue this sometime.
Yeah.